Greetings. When we talk about ancient Egypt, majestic pyramids, powerful pharaohs, and the golden treasures of Tutankhamun immediately come to mind. But have you ever wondered what came before them? Who laid the foundation for this incredible civilization, and how? Today we will journey thousands of years into the past, to an era before there was a unified Egypt, before hieroglyphs and the first dynasty. We will delve into the world of Predynastic Egypt and explore its heart, the mysterious and influential Naqada culture. It was this culture that became the cradle from which the state of the pharaohs was born. So, make yourselves comfortable. We are beginning to uncover the secrets of Egypt. And we'll start with the fact that the Naqada culture is an archaeological culture of Predynastic Upper Egypt, which existed from the 4th to the 3rd millennium BC. It is considered the direct predecessor and foundation of the pharaonic civilization, within which the key elements of Egyptian royal power, religion, and art were first formed. The study of this culture is inextricably linked to Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie, as his excavations in 1894-95 were the first systematic attempt to understand this pre-literate period in Egypt's history. His work provided the first scientific method for organizing the past in the absence of written sources. The sequence dating system developed by Petrie was based on the typological evolution of pottery found in the tombs of that time. He meticulously documented changes in its form and material, particularly the appearance and disappearance of certain types. Thus, he divided the general Naqada culture into 3 main phases, named after key sites: Amratian, Gerzean, and Sumerian. When he developed his system at the end of the 19th century, he understood that his chronology was based only on the archaeological finds available at that moment. He assumed that even older cultures or earlier stages of the pre-dynastic period might be discovered in the future, preceding the earliest burials known to him. Therefore, having arranged all the finds known to him into a relative chronological sequence, he divided them into 51 groups and arbitrarily assigned them numbers from SD 30 to SD 80. The numbers before SD 30 were deliberately left vacant so that if older artifacts were discovered, they could be added to the beginning of the scale without destroying or changing the already created and published system. In his 1957 work, the German Egyptologist Werner Kaiser significantly improved Petrie's system, establishing a 3-part structure now known as Naqada 1, 2, and 3. Kaiser's system, known as Stufen, divided the periods into subphases. For example, Naqada 2A, 2B, 2C, 2D, which allowed for a more detailed analysis of cultural changes based on ceramic assemblages from numerous sites. Research by modern scholars generally confirms the sequence established by Petrie and Kaiser, although they suggest that the transition to the first dynasty occurred more rapidly than previously thought. But let's return to the pottery. After all, it is one of the markers by which scientists not only distinguish periods from one another, but can also peer deeper behind the scenes of this mysterious world. Initially, during the Naqada 1 period, potters created true works of art. The most popular were elegant red vessels with a black rim polished to a shine, the result of a masterful firing technique. But even more interesting were other pots, on which the first narrative scenes in Egypt's history were painted with white paint. Hunters pursuing animals or landscapes of the Nile River. These drawings were not just decoration, they reflected one of the main ideas of the Egyptians: the human desire to establish order and control over the wild, chaotic world of nature. Over time, during the Naqada 2 period, everything changed. Exquisite handmade pottery began to be replaced by new styles that indicated mass production. Cream-colored vessels with red drawings appeared, but it should be noted here that the drawings themselves also changed. Instead of hunting scenes, artists now depicted large boats with standards and mysterious female figures, with arms raised to the sky. Perhaps these were goddesses or priestesses performing some ritual. Thus, we can assume that the society of this period became more concerned not so much with the struggle against nature, but with religious ceremonies and social life. At the same time, a huge amount of simple, rough pottery appeared, which was used in daily life. This meant that pottery had turned into an industry. Finally, in the Naqada III period, when Egypt was already on the threshold of unification, decorative drawings almost disappeared. Functional, standardized cylindrical jars, ideal for storing and transporting wine or oil, became mainstream. And it is on these utilitarian vessels that we find something extraordinary. The first hieroglyphs, or proto-hieroglyphs, which indicated the contents or the owner. Pottery became an instrument of administration and trade. The evolution of an ordinary object tells this story even more vividly. Pallets for grinding cosmetics. At the beginning, in the Naqada I period, it was a simple functional tool. A small rectangular or diamond-shaped tile made of schist, on which the green mineral malachite was ground to make eye paint. In the Naqada II period, pallets suddenly began to change shape. Now they were carved in the form of animals that lived in the Nile: fish, turtles, birds. As we can see, a simple utilitarian object is already acquiring symbolic meaning. It's even possible that such a pallet served as an amulet, intended to protect the owner or transfer the power of the animal depicted on it. But the most amazing thing happened at the end of the Naqada II period and the beginning of Naqada III. Pallets transformed into large, masterfully carved monuments, completely unsuitable for grinding pigments. They became what Michael Hoffman aptly called artifacts of power. Complex scenes were now depicted on them. A lion devouring enemies on the battlefield pallet, or the culminating scene on the famous Narmer pallet, where the king raises a mace over a defeated enemy, thereby proclaiming the unification of Egypt. Pallets became like stone billboards, glorifying the ruler's power and his divine right to rule. As we can see, by following the development of pottery and pallets, one can trace the very history of Naqada culture society, as ordinary functional items gradually transformed into symbols of status, power, and complex ideology. A simple slate pallet made the journey from a tool for grinding cosmetics to a monumental work of state propaganda. This is not just a change in art, it is a direct reflection of how power was concentrating in the hands of an elite, which was preparing to rule one of the greatest states the world had ever known. Speaking of society, it should be noted that at the beginning, in the Naqada I period, society resembled a mosaic of small, autonomous settlements. People lived more or less equitably, and this is evident from their burials, where each grave was a simple oval pit, with the deceased placed in a contracted position. They were given pots with food, jewelry, and stone pallets. No one stood out with excessive wealth, at least not after death. But over time, during the Naqada II period, this equality began to disappear. In the cemeteries alongside the ordinary graves, burials began to appear that were striking in their size and wealth. These were the tombs of the new elite, chiefs, and nobility, who could afford luxuries unavailable to others. Thus, through the language of graves, we see the birth of social hierarchy, or inequality. The most famous tomb of this period was the so-called Painted Tomb, or Tomb 100, in Mecca. The tomb was discovered by British archaeologists James Quibell and Frederick Green at the end of the 19th century. But, unfortunately, due to the imperfection of conservation methods at the time and the threat from agricultural work, the tomb itself was lost. Archaeologists managed to remove fragments of the painting from the walls and make watercolor copies, thanks to which we can study this outstanding work of art today. Thus, on the ancient plaster, a whole epic unfolded. A majestic procession of sacred boats sailed along the eternal Nile, accompanying the ruler's soul into the afterlife. Nearby, hunting scenes unfolded, where the order of civilization triumphed over the wild chaos of nature. But the most important figure was the ruler himself. Here he is. Like a deity, he stands between two huge lions, taming them. A true master of beasts. And here he is in another role, that of a formidable warrior, raising a club over bound enemies. This image, the image of the victor, would be copied hundreds of years later by every pharaoh from Narmer to Ramesses. So, we can assume that the walls of this tomb were not just decoration. They proclaimed the birth of a new ideology, the absolute power of the ruler, who stands above both people and nature. By the Naqada III period, the gap between the rich and the poor had become even wider. The tombs of rulers turned into monumental structures, filled with treasures, including rare imported goods. In general, the most outstanding tomb of that time can, without exaggeration, be called Tomb U, or as it is also called, the tomb of King Scorpion I, discovered in 1988 by a German archaeological expedition led by Günther Dreyer. This tomb became a true architectural revolution for its time. Unlike the modest burial pits of his predecessors, this was a huge underground palace for eternity, which by its scale and complexity demonstrated the incredible power and wealth of its owner. The tomb consisted of 12 separate rooms, built of mud brick. At the very heart of this labyrinth was a spacious burial chamber, intended for the king himself, and around it, like faithful servants, huddled smaller storage rooms for numerous offerings. The ancient architects conceived it not just as a grave, but as an eternal home that imitated a real dwelling. This brilliant idea so impressed descendants that this very tomb became the prototype for the grand royal tombs and mastabas of future eras, establishing the tradition of building a house for eternity. But the most interesting find, in my opinion, was the small, exquisite plaques of ivory. Each of them, no more than a few centimeters in size, had a small hole so it could be tied to something with a string. But the most important thing was on their surface. These were not just ornaments. Neatly scratched on these tags were signs, simple but recognizable images of animals, plants, mountains, and buildings. On many of them, a scorpion was clearly carved, which became the main evidence of who owned this tomb. Other signs were even simpler: notches, lines, and circles, which, as it turned out, denoted numbers. At first, it might have seemed that these were amulets or ritual objects, but when scientists put all the pieces of the puzzle together, they realized they were holding something much more important. These were the world's oldest labels. The significance of these small tags turned out to be simply colossal, forcing historians to rewrite entire chapters on the dawn of civilization. Suddenly, it became clear that Egyptian writing was born not to record great myths or sacred hymns, but out of a purely practical need for the accounting and management of the resources of a vast, emerging state. This discovery not only aged Egyptian writing by several centuries, but also, most importantly, proved its independent origin, destroying the old theory of borrowing the idea from Mesopotamia. Furthermore, the geographical names deciphered on the tags, like dots on an ancient map, outlined the true scale of King Scorpion's realm. His power and trade connections extended for hundreds of kilometers, uniting disparate lands under a single control long before the first pharaohs. Thus, these modest bone plaques told a grandiose story not only about the birth of writing, but also about the birth of the Egyptian state itself. If we talk about religion, since there are no texts, scientists rely only on archaeological finds. Burial customs tell us how the people of the Naqada culture imagined life after death. They believed in the importance of preserving the body. The deceased were buried in the dry desert sand, where the bodies dried out and were preserved naturally. This belief that the body is necessary for the afterlife became the basis for the later complex practice of artificial mummification. The graves were filled with everything necessary for eternity: food and drinks in pots, tools, weapons, and jewelry. This indicates that the afterlife was imagined as a continuation of earthly life. Human figurines were also placed in the graves, especially female ones, with mysteriously raised arms. Scientists believe that these are not portraits of the deceased, but images of goddesses, mourners, or participants in rituals who were meant to magically ensure the rebirth of the deceased in the afterlife. Predynastic religion was not something separate from everyday life. It was closely intertwined with political power. The main themes in art, victory over chaos, military triumph, divine patronage, were all aimed at one thing: the legitimization of the elite's power. The most popular gods, such as Horus, came from the most powerful cities. Therefore, the religion we see in the archaeological record is not a popular belief, but a state religion in its infancy, whose main function was to explain and justify why enormous power should be concentrated in the hands of one ruler. At the same time, the elites did not invent a new religion from scratch. The basic beliefs, the need to preserve the body and provide the deceased with provisions, existed throughout the entire Naqada period. The rulers simply took these generally accepted ideas and monumentalized them. The royal tomb is not something fundamentally new, but simply an incredibly enlarged and enriched version of an ordinary person's grave. The logic was the same. You need a home and provisions in the afterlife. But while a few pots and a pit were enough for a common person, an underground palace with hundreds of jars of wine and sacrificed servants was built for the king. By embracing a common belief on a scale unattainable for others, the elite demonstrated their superhuman status. Thus, relying on conservative and universally understood religious ideas, they justified a new, radical political inequality. But how exactly did the disparate lands along the Nile turn into the world's first great state? This is one of the most interesting questions in ancient history, and there are several fascinating answers to it, resembling different versions of the same event. The traditional version, which can be called unification by mace, asserts that a powerful king from the south, probably named Narmer, conquered the northern lands by force. The main evidence for this is the famous Narmer palette, where we see the king raising a mace over a defeated enemy, and on the reverse side, inspecting rows of decapitated prisoners. It is a vivid picture of violent unification. But when archaeologists began digging in the north, in the Nile Delta, they found no traces of a great war, such as destroyed cities. Instead, as the scholar Christiana Kohler noted, they saw that over the centuries, the local culture slowly dissolved into the southern one. It looked less like a conquest and more like cultural assimilation. The southern Naqada culture, with its more advanced crafts, gradually displaced local traditions. This brings us to the third, deepest idea, proposed by scholars like Toby Wilkinson. He argues that the Narmer palette is not so much a historical record as a powerful work of propaganda. Its purpose was not to document one specific battle, but to create and spread an ideology according to which the king is the divine guarantor of order, triumphing over chaos. So, where's the truth? Probably somewhere in the middle. The Narmer palette is the official story the kings wanted to tell, a story of heroic conquest. And the clay pots in the north tell a more, everyday story of slow cultural change. Perhaps the process was predominantly a peaceful, cultural, and economic colonization, interrupted from time to time by outbreaks of violence against those who resisted. These bloody episodes were then immortalized in royal art as the official version of unification. But the real unification was, first and foremost, ideological. Egypt's success lay not only in military strength, but in the creation of an incredibly powerful idea of a divine king, the only force capable of defeating chaos and maintaining cosmic order. This idea proved so compelling that it ensured the civilization's stability for over 3,000 years. Therefore, the unification of Egypt was not just a joining of territories, but the triumph of a powerful ideology that became the operating system for the entire society. Friends, thank you for watching this video to the end. If you liked the video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already.